The rain fell hard on the small town of Westfield as Margaret Chun walked slowly down Oak Street, her worn leather bag pressed close to her chest and her simple gray cardigan doing little to keep the cold away. She had been living in this quiet place for only 3 weeks now, and everything still felt strange and new. The big house she once called home was gone, sold along with most of her things after Thomas passed away 6 months ago. Now she lived in a tiny apartment above the bakery, where the smell of fresh bread reminded her that life went on even when it felt like hers had stopped. Margaret paused in front of the Westfield Community Music Center, a modest brick building, with yellow light spilling from its windows. She could hear the faint sound of piano music drifting through the glass doors, and something deep inside her chest began to stir. It had been so long since she had touched piano keys, so long since she had let music fill the empty spaces in her heart. Thomas used to say that music was her first love, and he was right. Before she became his wife, before she became the quiet woman who baked cookies for church sales and tended to her garden, she had been someone else entirely. She stood there for a long moment, listening to the simple melody coming from inside. It was not perfect, not polished, but it was real and honest in a way that made her eyes water. The student was probably young, maybe just starting to learn, but they were trying so hard. Margaret remembered that feeling, the joy of discovering that your fingers could make something beautiful happen. She remembered being 7 years old and reaching for piano keys for the first time. How the sound had made her feel like she was flying. The front door opened with a soft chime, and warm air rushed out to greet her. A young woman with bright red hair sat behind a desk covered in music sheets and coffee cups. She looked up at Margaret with a friendly smile, taking in the simple clothes and the nervous way Margaret held her bag. "Can I help you?" the woman asked kindly. Margaret cleared her throat softly. "I was wondering about piano lessons," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. I was hoping to maybe join a group or something. I used to play a little bit when I was younger." The receptionist's smile grew warmer. "Oh, that's wonderful. We have several adult groups here. Let me get Mrs. Patterson for you. She's our music director." Margaret waited quietly while the young woman disappeared down a hallway. She could hear more music now, different instruments mixing together in a way that sounded like controlled chaos. Students were practicing, teachers were giving gentle corrections, and the whole building seemed to hum with musical energy. It felt like coming home to a place she had never been before. Mrs. Patterson appeared a few minutes later, a tall woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a flowing purple dress and had the kind of confident walk that came from years of standing in front of students. Her eyes were sharp but kind as she looked Margaret up and down, taking in the worn cardigan and the careful way Margaret held herself. "Welcome to our center," Mrs. Patterson said warmly. "I understand you're interested in piano lessons?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, I thought maybe I could join one of your adult groups. I don't want to be any trouble." Mrs. Patterson noticed the calluses on Margaret's hands and assumed they came from years of cleaning houses or working in gardens. The woman in front of her seemed tired and maybe a little lost. The kind of person who had probably never had much money for fancy things like music lessons. But there was something gentle about her that made Mrs. Patterson want to help. "Well, we have a lovely beginners group that meets on Tuesday and Thursday evenings," Mrs. Patterson said. "They're all adults who are just starting out or getting back into music after many years. I think you'd fit right in." Margaret felt her heart sink a little. She had hoped to maybe play something more challenging, something that would remind her of who she used to be. But she also knew that she could not tell this kind woman the truth about her past. How could she explain that she had once performed on the world's biggest stages? How could she say that her fingers had once danced across keys in concert halls, where tickets cost more than most people made in a week? That life felt like it had belonged to someone else entirely. "That sounds perfect," Margaret said instead. "When do they meet?" "Tonight, actually, in about an hour." "Would you like to observe first, or would you prefer to jump right in?" Mrs. Patterson asked. Margaret glanced toward the sound of piano music. "I think I'd like to start right away, if that's okay." Mrs. Patterson smiled and led her down a hallway lined with practice rooms. Through the small windows in each door, Margaret could see students of all ages working on their music. A little girl was carefully playing scales, her tongue sticking out in concentration. A teenage boy was struggling through what sounded like a simplified version of a classical piece. An elderly man was playing hymns with shaking but determined hands. They arrived at a larger room where 5 adults sat around 2 upright pianos. The group looked up as Mrs. Patterson entered with Margaret trailing behind. There was a woman about Margaret's age with kind eyes and gray hair, a younger man who looked nervous but eager, and 3 others who seemed to be at various stages of learning. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Margaret," Mrs. Patterson announced. "She's going to be joining our group." The others smiled and waved, and Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest. These people seemed genuinely happy to have her here, even though they knew nothing about her. She took a seat at the empty piano bench and placed her hands gently on the keys. They felt cool and familiar under her fingers, like greeting an old friend after a long absence. "We're working on some simple pieces tonight," Mrs. Patterson explained. "Nothing too difficult. Margaret, why don't you try playing along with this melody?" She placed a sheet of music in front of Margaret, a simple arrangement of amazing grace, with large notes and basic fingering marked above each measure. Margaret looked at the music and felt her heart race. She could play this piece. In her sleep, could probably play it backward if someone asked her to. But she forced herself to read the notes carefully, to play slowly and deliberately like someone who was still learning. As her fingers began to move, something magical happened. The simple melody filled the room with a beauty that surprised everyone, including Margaret herself. Even played slowly and carefully, the music carried a depth and emotion that made the other students stop and listen. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes as she played, not because the music was difficult, but because it felt so good to be making music again. Even in this simple way, when she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then the other students began to clap, and Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly. "Very nice, Margaret," she said. "You have natural rhythm. I think you're going to do well in our group." Margaret smiled and folded her hands in her lap. For the first time in months, she felt like she belonged somewhere. These people had welcomed her without questions, without needing to know about her past or her pain. They just wanted to share their love of music with her, and that was enough. As the lesson continued, Margaret played along with the simple pieces, careful to match the pace and skill level of the others. She watched the way Mrs. Patterson gently corrected students, how she encouraged them when they made mistakes, how she celebrated their small victories. It reminded Margaret of why she had fallen in love with music in the first place, not for the fame or the applause, but for the pure joy of creating something beautiful. When the lesson ended, the other students gathered their music and said their goodbyes. Margaret packed up slowly, not wanting this feeling to end. Mrs. Patterson approached her as she was getting ready to leave. "You did wonderful tonight, Margaret," she said. "I can tell you have a real love for music. We meet again on Thursday at the same time. I hope you'll come back." Margaret nodded, clutching her bag to her chest. "I will," she promised. "Thank you for letting me be part of this." As she walked back out into the rain, Margaret felt lighter than she had in months. She had found a place where she could be herself again, even if it was not the self she used to be. Music had welcomed her back, and that was all that mattered. The rain had stopped by the time she reached her apartment, and for the first time since moving to Westfield, Margaret felt like she might actually be able to call this place home. Margaret had been attending the beginner piano group for 3 weeks now, and each Tuesday and Thursday evening had become the highlight of her quiet days. She would arrive exactly 5 minutes before class started, carrying the same worn leather bag and wearing one of her simple cardigans. The other students had grown comfortable with her presence, and she had learned their names and their stories. There was Helen, a retired nurse who had always wanted to learn piano, but never had the time. Robert worked at the hardware store and dreamed of playing jazz music someday. Sarah was a young mother who came to class as her 1 hour of peace away. From her three small children, Mrs. Patterson had grown quite fond of Margaret, often commenting to the other teachers about how the quiet woman seemed to absorb every instruction like a sponge. What Mrs. Patterson did not know was that Margaret was not learning these simple pieces so much as she was remembering how to hold herself back. Every time her fingers touched the keys, muscle memory threatened to take over and transform the basic melodies into something far more complex and beautiful. Margaret had to concentrate hard to play badly enough to fit in with the group during their coffee breaks, which happened halfway through each 2-hour session. Margaret would sit quietly at a corner table and listen to the teachers talk. Mrs. Patterson would often join Mr. Rodriguez and Miss Kim, the other piano instructors, and they would discuss their students and upcoming events. Margaret learned that Mr. Rodriguez had studied music in college, but had never quite made it as a professional performer. Miss Kim was younger and still full of dreams about discovering the next great musical talent among her students. It was during one of these coffee breaks that Margaret first heard about the annual fundraising gala. Mrs. Patterson was stirring sugar into her coffee with more force than necessary. Clearly frustrated about something, Mr. Rodriguez noticed her mood and asked, "What was wrong?" "It's this gala," Mrs. Patterson sighed. "Every year we need to put on a show that will impress the donors and convince them to keep supporting our center. But this year the board wants something really special. They want us to perform a piece that will show off our advanced teaching methods." Miss Kim looked up from her stack of sheet music. What did they have in mind? "Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, Mrs. Patterson said, and Margaret nearly choked on her tea. "Can you believe it? They want one of our students to perform one of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire. They think it will prove that our center can produce serious musicians." Margaret set down her cup carefully, her hands trembling slightly. She knew that concerto better than she knew her own heartbeat. She had performed it dozens of times with orchestras around the world, had recorded it twice, and had even written detailed notes about its interpretation that were still studied in music schools. But she forced herself to look confused and interested, like someone who had never heard of Rachmaninoff before. "That sounds very difficult," Margaret said softly. "Are any of your students ready for something like that?" Mr. Rodriguez shook his head. "That's the problem. Our most advanced student is Jessica, and she's been working on intermediate pieces for 2 years. She's talented, but asking her to perform Rachmaninoff would be like asking someone who just learned to drive to compete in a race." "What about simplifying it?" Miss Kim suggested. "Maybe we could arrange an easier version." Mrs. Patterson made a face. The board was very specific. They want the real thing, or at least something close to it. They've been to other fundraisers where music centers performed big, impressive pieces, and they want us to prove we can do the same. Margaret listened to this conversation with growing sadness. She could see how much pressure these teachers were under, how much they wanted their center to succeed. The Westfield Community Music Center was clearly more than just a place to teach music. It was a lifeline for people like Helen and Robert and Sarah, people who had found joy and purpose in learning to play. If the center lost its funding because they could not put on an impressive enough show, all of these people would lose something precious. Over the next few days, Margaret found herself thinking about the conversation more and more. She would lie awake in her small apartment above the bakery, listening to the sounds of the town settling into sleep, and imagine what it would feel like to play that concerto again. Her fingers would move against her blanket as if they were touching piano keys, running through the complicated passages that had once been as natural to her as breathing. She began to notice things about the music center that she had missed before. The piano benches were worn and wobbling, held together with tape and hope. The sheet music was photocopied so many times that some of the notes were barely readable. The coffee in the break room was weak and bitter, clearly bought from the cheapest supplier they could find. These people were doing so much with so little, and they were doing it because they truly loved music and wanted to share that love with others. During the next class, Margaret watched Mrs. Patterson work with Jessica, the most advanced student. The girl was talented and worked hard, but Margaret could see the frustration in her face as she struggled. With a piece that was still far below the level of the Rachmaninoff concerto, Mrs. Patterson was patient and encouraging, but Margaret could see the worry in her eyes. The gala was only 6 weeks away, and they were no closer to finding a solution after class. Margaret lingered in the hallway, pretending to look at the bulletin board covered with concert announcements and student achievements. She could hear Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Rodriguez, and Miss Kim talking in the main classroom, their voices carrying through the thin walls. "Maybe we should just tell the board it's impossible," Mr. Rodriguez was saying. "They don't understand how difficult that piece really is." "We can't," Mrs. Patterson replied. "The Wilson Foundation has already promised to match donations if we can prove our center is producing serious musicians. That matching grant would keep us running for another 3 years. What if we found a guest performer?" Miss Kim suggested. "Someone from the city who could come and play the piece for us?" Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "The board was very clear that it had to be one of our students. They want to show off our teaching, not just bring in a professional." Margaret felt her heart breaking for these dedicated teachers. They had given her so much in the past few weeks, a place to belong, a reason to get up each morning, a way to connect with music again without having to explain her past. Now they needed help, and she was the only person who could provide it. But how could she reveal the truth without destroying the simple, peaceful life she had built here? As she walked home that evening, Margaret made a decision. She would find a way to help, even if it meant risking everything she had worked to build in Westfield. These people had welcomed her without questions, had given her a place to heal, and now it was time to give something back. She spent the rest of the evening sitting at her kitchen table, writing and rewriting a letter to Mrs. Patterson. She wanted to offer her help without revealing too much about her background. She wanted to suggest that maybe, just maybe, she might be able to learn the piece if they were willing to work with her, but every version of the letter sounded either too modest or too confident. How could she convince them to let her try without making them suspicious about her true abilities? How could she help them save their center without destroying the quiet anonymity that had become so precious to her? Finally, she gave up on the letter and decided to find another way. Tomorrow was Thursday, and there would be another class, another coffee break, another chance to listen to the teachers worry about their impossible situation. Maybe she would find the courage to speak up then, to offer herself as a solution to their problem. As she got ready for bed, Margaret caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror. She looked like exactly what she appeared to be, a quiet, ordinary woman who had found a simple pleasure in playing basic piano pieces with other beginners. But behind her eyes, she could see traces of the person she used to be, the artist who had once commanded the attention of audiences around the world. Tomorrow, she would have to decide which version of herself was more important, the hidden one who could save the music center, or the simple one who had finally found peace. Thursday evening arrived with a heavy feeling in Margaret's chest. She had barely slept the night before, her mind racing with thoughts of the music center's problem and her own secret ability to solve it. She dressed in her usual simple clothes and walked to the center through the crisp autumn air, but tonight felt different somehow. Tonight she might have to make a choice that would change everything. The beginner's class went as usual at first. Helen struggled through her scales while Robert worked on a simple jazz melody that made him smile despite his mistakes. Sarah played a lullaby she wanted to learn for her children, and Margaret played along with the group exercises, still careful to match their pace and skill level. But she found it harder to concentrate tonight, her fingers wanting to add harmonies and variations that would have revealed far too much about her true abilities. During the coffee break, Margaret took her usual seat in the corner and listened as the teachers gathered around their small table. The conversation quickly turned to the gala, and Margaret could see the stress lines around Mrs. Patterson's eyes had deepened since Tuesday. "I've been thinking about this all week," Mrs. Patterson said, stirring her coffee without really drinking. Maybe we should consider asking the board to choose a different piece. Something more reasonable for our students." Mr. Rodriguez shook his head. "I already tried that. They're not interested in reasonable. They want impressive, and they think impressive means difficult. They've heard that the Riverside Music Academy had their student perform a Mozart concerto last year, and they want us to do something even more challenging. But Mozart is one thing, Miss Kim said quietly. Rachmaninoff is completely different. It's not just technically difficult, it requires a level of musical understanding that takes years to develop. Even if we had a student who could play the notes, they would need to understand the emotional depth of the piece. Margaret felt her heart skip when Miss Kim mentioned the emotional depth. She remembered the first time she had truly understood that concerto, not just as a collection of notes to be played correctly, but as a story of longing and triumph that Rachmaninoff had poured out of his soul. She had been 22 years old, performing with the Berlin Philharmonic, and halfway through the second movement she had felt something click inside her. Suddenly she was not just playing the music, she was living it, breathing it, becoming part of it. What if we found someone who could teach Jessica more intensively? Mrs. Patterson suggested. Maybe if we brought in a specialist from the city, someone who really knows this piece. With what money? Mr. Rodriguez asked gently. We're already stretching our budget just to keep the lights on. The only reason we can even consider this gala is because the board promised to cover the costs if we can pull it off. Margaret watched the three teachers sit in discouraged silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the impossible situation. She could see how much they cared about their students and their center, how desperately they wanted to find a solution that would keep the music alive in Westfield. The weight of her secret knowledge felt heavier than ever. Then Mrs. Patterson looked up, and her eyes met Margaret's across the small room. For a moment, Margaret thought she saw something different in the teacher's expression, not the usual kind patience she showed to struggling beginners, but something more curious and considering. Margaret quickly looked away, pretending to be interested in a poster about proper hand position. You know, Mrs. Patterson said slowly, we've been thinking about this all wrong. We keep assuming that we need to find someone who already knows how to play difficult music. But what if we found someone who could learn it? Someone who's not afraid of a challenge? Mr. Rodriguez looked skeptical. In 6 weeks? Even if we had someone with natural talent? That's not nearly enough time to learn a piece like that. Maybe. Not for a perfect performance, Mrs. Patterson admitted. But what if we found someone who could give it an honest try? Someone who could play it well enough to show the board that we're serious about developing our students? Margaret felt her pulse quicken. She could sense where this conversation was heading, and she was not sure she was ready for it. But who? Miss Kim asked. Jessica is our most advanced student, and she's nowhere near ready for something like that. Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, her eyes drifting back toward Margaret's corner. What about Margaret? The words hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat, and she had to work hard to keep her face neutral and confused. Margaret? Mr. Rodriguez sounded surprised. She's in the beginner group. She's been playing simple melodies for 3 weeks. I know, Mrs. Patterson said, but there's something about the way she plays. Have you noticed? Even when she's playing basic pieces, there's something different about her touch. She has natural rhythm and her timing is always perfect. And she never seems frustrated or overwhelmed, even when we introduce new concepts. Margaret felt exposed and terrified. Had she been too careful to hide her abilities? Had something in her playing given her away? Plus, Mrs. Patterson continued, she's older and more mature than our other students. She might have the discipline and focus needed to tackle something this challenging. And she has those strong hands. I bet she could handle the technical demands if we worked with her. Miss Kim looked thoughtful. It's true that she picks things up quickly, but Rachmaninoff? That's a huge leap from amazing grace. What if we approached her about it? Mrs. Patterson suggested. Not as a demand, but as an opportunity. We could explain the situation and see if she'd be interested in trying. The worst she can say is, no. Margaret felt trapped. She wanted to help these people who had been so kind to her, but she was terrified of what would happen if they discovered who she really was. Would they treat her differently? Would they feel foolish for having taught her such basic pieces? Would her peaceful new life in Westfield be destroyed? I don't know, Mr. Rodriguez said hesitantly. It seems like a lot of pressure to put on someone who's just learning. But what if she surprises us? Mrs. Patterson asked. What if she's one of those people who rises to meet a challenge? I've seen it happen before, students who seem ordinary until you give them something that really tests them. Margaret realized that Mrs. Patterson was looking directly at her again, and this time she could not look away. The teacher's eyes were kind but determined, and Margaret could see that she had already made up her mind. "Margaret," Mrs. Patterson called across the room, "could you come over here for a moment? We'd like to talk to you about something." Margaret felt her legs shake as she stood up and walked over to the teacher's table. This was at the moment when her quiet, simple life would either continue or change forever. She clasped her hands together to keep them from trembling and tried to look curious rather than terrified. "Margaret, dear," Mrs. Patterson began gently, "we have a rather unusual request to make of you. It might sound crazy, but we hope you'll at least consider it." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice to stay steady if she spoke. "Our music center has an important fundraising gala coming up in 6 weeks," Mrs. Patterson continued. "We need to perform a challenging piece to impress our donors, and we've been struggling to find the right student for the job. We know you're still working on the basics, but we wondered if you might be interested in attempting something more difficult." Margaret's heart was pounding so hard she was sure the teachers could hear it. "What kind of piece?" She managed to ask. "It's a piano concerto by Rachmaninoff," Mrs. Patterson said. "It's quite challenging, but we believe that with intensive practice and all of our help, you might be able to manage it. Of course, we wouldn't expect perfection, just your best effort." Margaret looked at the 3 hopeful faces surrounding her and felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her shoulders. She could say no and keep her secret safe, or she could say yes and risk everything she had built in Westfield. "I don't know," she said quietly. "It sounds very difficult." "It is," Mrs. Patterson admitted. "But Margaret, there's something special about the way you play. We've all noticed it. You have a natural musicality that we rarely see, and we think you might be capable of more than you realize." Margaret felt tears threatening behind her eyes. These teachers were offering her exactly what she had been hoping for, a chance to play real music again, but they were doing it for all the wrong reasons. "Could I think about it?" she asked. "Of course," Mrs. Patterson said warmly. "Take all the time you need. But Margaret, I hope you'll consider it. We really believe you could do something wonderful." As Margaret walked home that evening, she felt as though she was standing at the edge of a cliff. Behind her was the safe, quiet life she had built in Westfield, and ahead of her was the terrifying possibility of being herself again. The choice was hers to make, but she was no longer sure which path would lead to happiness. Margaret spent the entire weekend thinking about Mrs. Patterson's request. She walked through the quiet streets of Westfield, sat by the small pond in the town park, and lay awake in her narrow bed above the bakery, but no matter what she did, she could not stop hearing the hope in the teacher's voice. By Monday morning, she had made her decision. She would say yes, but she would have to be very careful about how she approached the challenge. When Tuesday evening arrived, Margaret felt nervous in a way she had not experienced in years. She arrived at the music center a few minutes early and found Mrs. Patterson setting up the classroom with extra sheet music and a determined expression on her face. "Margaret," Mrs. Patterson said with a warm smile, "have you had a chance to think about our conversation?" Margaret nodded slowly. "I would like to try," she said quietly. "I don't know if I can do it, but I would like to try." Mrs. Patterson's face lit up with excitement. "Oh, Margaret, that's wonderful. I was hoping you'd say yes. I have a feeling you're going to surprise all of us." If only she knew, Margaret thought to herself, but she just smiled and asked what the next steps would be. "Well, first, I think you should hear the piece," Mrs. Patterson said, leading Margaret to the piano. "I have a recording here, and I thought we could listen to it together so you can get a sense of what we're working toward." Margaret sat down next to Mrs. Patterson as the older woman pressed play on a small CD player. The familiar opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the room, and Margaret felt her heart clench with memory and longing. She had performed this piece so many times that she could predict every note, every subtle change in tempo, every moment where the piano and orchestra would dance together in perfect harmony, but she forced herself to listen as if hearing it for the first time, nodding thoughtfully at the complex passages and looking appropriately overwhelmed during the most technically challenging sections. "It's beautiful," Margaret said when the first movement ended, and she meant it. No matter how many times she heard this music, it never failed to move her. "It is," Mrs. Patterson agreed. "But I won't lie to you, Margaret. It's also incredibly difficult. The good news is that we don't expect you to learn the entire concerto. We thought you could focus on the first movement, and Mr. Rodriguez will play a simplified orchestral part on the second piano." Margaret felt a flutter of panic. Playing with an orchestra was one thing, but playing with Mr. Rodriguez, who would be watching her every move and listening to every note, would be much more challenging. She would have to be even more careful to disguise her true abilities. "That sounds good," Margaret said. "When would we start practicing?" "Right away," Mrs. Patterson said enthusiastically. "I was thinking we could work together 3 times a week, Tuesday and Thursday with the regular group, and then I'd like to schedule some individual sessions with you on Saturdays. Would that work?" Margaret agreed, and Mrs. Patterson immediately pulled out a copy of the sheet music. Margaret looked down at the familiar notation and felt her fingers begin to twitch with muscle memory. She had owned this same edition of the concerto for over 20 years, and she knew every marking and fingering suggestion by heart. "Now, don't let this intimidate you," Mrs. Patterson said, pointing to the dense clusters of notes on the first page. "We'll start very slowly and break it down into small sections. The most important thing is not to get overwhelmed." Margaret nodded and placed her hands on the keys. This was the moment she had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. She would have to play this music that lived in her very soul, but she would have to play it badly enough to convince Mrs. Patterson that she was struggling to learn it. She began with the opening measures, deliberately playing them more slowly and carefully than necessary. She made small mistakes in places where she knew every note perfectly, and she paused occasionally as if she were reading the music for the first time. But even with all her efforts to play poorly, something of her true understanding came through. In the way she shaped the phrases and the natural flow of her rhythm. Mrs. Patterson listened intently, occasionally making suggestions about fingering or timing. "That's very good, Margaret," she said after they had worked through the first page. "You're picking this up much faster than I expected. Your musical instincts are really quite remarkable." Margaret felt a blush creep up her neck. "Thank you," she said. "It's just such beautiful music. It makes me want to play it well." Over the next few weeks, Margaret fell into a routine that was both thrilling and exhausting. She would attend the regular beginner classes on Tuesday and Thursday, where she continued to play simple pieces with Helen and Robert and Sarah, but afterward, she would stay for an additional hour to work on the Rachmaninoff with Mrs. Patterson. And then she would go home and practice in secret. The secret practice sessions were the hardest part of her deception. Margaret had convinced Mrs. Patterson to let her borrow a key to the music center so she could practice early in the morning. When the building was empty, she told the teacher that she was a naturally early riser and that practicing before the bakery opened would help her concentrate better. What Margaret did not tell Mrs. Patterson was that every morning at 6 o'clock she would let herself into the main performance hall and play the concerto the way it was meant to be played. In the empty building, with only the morning light streaming through the windows, Margaret would allow her fingers to remember their old magic. She would play with the technical mastery and emotional depth that had once earned her standing ovations. In concert halls around the world, these morning sessions were both a relief and a torment. It felt so good to be herself again, to let her hands move with their natural speed and precision, to feel the music flow through her the way it had for so many years. But it also reminded her of everything she had lost, everything she had walked away from when she chose to disappear into this quiet life. After each secret practice session, Margaret would spend a few minutes playing the piece the way she was supposed to be learning it, slowly, carefully, with the kinds of mistakes that Mrs. Patterson expected from someone who was struggling with such difficult music. She had to be ready to demonstrate her supposed progress during their Saturday lessons. The Saturday sessions were the most challenging of all. Margaret would arrive at the music center to find Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Rodriguez, and sometimes Miss Kim waiting for her with encouraging smiles and helpful suggestions. They would work together for 2 hours, with Margaret playing the piano part while Mr. Rodriguez accompanied her on the second piano. Mr. Rodriguez had been skeptical about the whole plan at first, but as the weeks passed, his attitude began to change. Margaret could see the surprise in his eyes when she played certain passages with more skill than he had expected. She could hear the growing excitement in his voice when he made suggestions about interpretation and phrasing. "Margaret," he said, "during one particularly good session, you're really starting to understand this piece. The way you played that passage just now, it was almost like you could feel what Rachmaninoff was trying to express." Margaret felt her heart pound with the fear of discovery. "I just try to listen to the music and let it guide me," she said, which was absolutely true, even if it was not the whole truth. As the weeks passed, Margaret found herself walking a tightrope between her two identities. During the day, she was the quiet woman who lived above the bakery and smiled at her neighbors on the street. In the beginner classes, she was the humble student who was grateful for every bit of encouragement. But in those secret morning hours, and sometimes even during the Saturday sessions when she forgot to hold herself back, she was the artist she had always been. The teachers began to notice something special about Margaret's playing, but they attributed it to natural talent and hard work rather than decades of professional training. Mrs. Patterson would often comment on Margaret's surprising musical instincts, and Mr. Rodriguez started asking her opinion about interpretation, in a way that suggested he was beginning to see her as more than just a beginner. Margaret knew that she was playing a dangerous game. The closer she got to the gala performance, the harder it became to maintain the pretense that she was struggling to learn the piece. But she also knew that these people had become important to her in a way she had not expected. Mrs. Patterson's faith in her abilities, Mr. Rodriguez's growing respect, and even the encouragement of her fellow beginners had given her something she had not realized she was missing, a sense of belonging and purpose. 3 weeks before the gala, Margaret made another decision that would change everything. She decided that when the time came for her performance, she would not hold back. She would play the concerto the way it deserved to be played, with all the skill and passion she possessed. She would give Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Rodriguez and the music center the performance they needed to save their program. She just hoped that when they discovered the truth about who she really was, they would understand why she had hidden it for so long. The night of the gala arrived with a crisp October chill that made Margaret's hands feel stiff as she walked toward the music center. She had spent the entire day trying to stay calm, but her heart had been racing since the moment she woke up. Tonight would be the end of her carefully constructed secret, and she was not sure what would happen when the truth finally came out. She had chosen to wear the one elegant dress she had brought with her to Westfield, a simple black gown that had once been her favorite for concert performances. As she looked at herself in the mirror above her small bathroom sink, she could see traces of the woman she used to be. Her posture was straighter, her hands steadier, and there was something in her eyes that had not been there since Thomas died. The music center had been transformed for the evening. White tablecloths covered round tables in the main hall, and small arrangements of fall flowers sat next to flickering candles. Margaret could see well-dressed people arriving through the front doors, many of them carrying checkbooks and wearing the kind of jewelry that suggested they had money to donate. These were the people who would decide whether the music center survived or closed, and Margaret felt the weight of that responsibility settling on her shoulders. Mrs. Patterson found her in the small practice room where she had been waiting, and Margaret could see the nervousness in her teacher's eyes. "Margaret, you look beautiful," Mrs. Patterson said, but her voice was tight with worry. "How are you feeling?" "Nervous," Margaret admitted. which was completely true even if the reasons were different than Mrs. Patterson imagined. "That's perfectly normal," Mrs. Patterson said kindly. "Remember, we're not expecting perfection. Just do your best, and that will be enough. The important thing is that you're brave enough to try." Margaret nodded, but inside she was thinking about the decision she had made. She would not just try, she would succeed. She would give these people the performance they needed to save their center, even if it meant revealing everything she had worked to hide. Mr. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, looking uncomfortable. In his formal suit. "The audience is seated," he said. "Are you ready, Margaret?" Margaret took a deep breath and followed them toward the main hall. As they walked, she could hear the murmur of conversation and the clink of glasses. Through the doorway, she could see the black grand piano waiting on the small stage, with a second piano positioned beside it for Mr. Rodriguez's accompaniment. "Remember," Mrs. Patterson whispered as they reached the stage, "we've arranged a simplified version of the orchestral part. Mr. Rodriguez will follow your lead, so don't worry about matching his tempo. Just play the way you've been practicing." Margaret climbed the steps to the stage and felt a familiar surge of energy as she approached the piano. The audience fell quiet, and she could feel dozens of eyes watching her. Some of the faces looked curious, others skeptical, and a few seemed to be checking their watches as if they were not expecting much from this part of the evening. She sat down at the piano bench and adjusted it to the proper height, her movements automatic after years of performances. The keys felt cool and familiar under her fingers as she placed her hands in position. Mr. Rodriguez took his place at the second piano. Giving her an encouraging nod, Mrs. Patterson stepped forward to introduce the performance. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we are pleased to present one of our adult students, Margaret Chun, performing the first movement of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. Margaret has been studying with us for only 2 months, but she has shown remarkable dedication and natural talent. Please join me in welcoming her to the stage." The audience applauded politely, and Margaret felt a moment of panic. 2 months. That was all they thought she had been learning. How could she possibly explain what was about to happen? But then the opening measures began, and Margaret felt something shift inside her. Her fingers found the keys with the confidence of someone who had played this piece hundreds of times. The music flowed out of her with a beauty and complexity that made the audience sit up straighter in their seats. This was not the simplified version they had been expecting. This was the real Rachmaninoff, played with the skill and passion of a true artist. Mr. Rodriguez nearly missed his entrance, his eyes wide with shock as he realized that Margaret was playing far beyond anything they had practiced together. But he was a skilled musician, and he quickly adapted to her tempo and interpretation, his simplified accompaniment suddenly seeming inadequate next to her masterful performance. In the audience, Margaret could see faces changing from polite interest to amazement. People were leaning forward in their seats, some with their mouths slightly open, as they realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Mrs. Patterson stood frozen at the side of the stage, her hand pressed to her chest, staring at her student as if she were seeing a ghost. Margaret lost herself in the music the way she had not done in years. Every note carried the weight of her grief for Thomas, her loneliness in this new town, and her gratitude for the people who had welcomed her without questions. She played with the technical precision that had made her famous, but also with an emotional depth that came from months of hiding her true self. The difficult passages that would have challenged even advanced students flowed from her fingers like water. The dramatic climaxes soared with power and control, and the tender moments spoke with a vulnerability that brought tears to many eyes in the audience. This was not just someone playing notes correctly. This was an artist telling a story through music. As the first movement built toward its triumphant conclusion, Margaret felt a sense of freedom she had not experienced since before Thomas became ill. She was herself again, completely and fully, and it felt like coming home after a long journey through darkness. The final notes rang out into silence, and for a moment the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Then the audience erupted in applause. That went on, people rising to their feet and clapping with an enthusiasm that suggested they knew they had witnessed something special. Margaret stood and took her bow, feeling both exhilarated and terrified. She had done it. She had given them the performance they needed. But now she would have to face the consequences of her deception. Mrs. Patterson was the first to reach her as she stepped down from the stage. The teacher's eyes were filled with tears and her voice shook as she spoke. Margaret, that was incredible. I don't understand. How did you learn to play like that? That wasn't what we practiced. Margaret took a deep breath and looked at the woman who had been so kind to her. Mrs. Patterson, I need to tell you something. I haven't been entirely honest with you about my background. Before she could continue, a man in an expensive suit approached them. Excuse me, he said to Margaret, but I have to ask, are you Margaret Chun, the pianist? Margaret Chun, who used to perform with the London Symphony Orchestra? Margaret felt her secret crumble completely. She nodded slowly. Yes, I am. The man's face broke into a wide smile. I thought so. I heard you perform in Boston about 15 years ago. You were magnificent then, and you're even more beautiful now. What are you doing here in Westfield? Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding her, Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Rodriguez, Miss Kim, and even some of her fellow beginner students who had been invited to watch. She saw confusion, amazement, and perhaps a little hurt in their eyes. I came here to disappear, Margaret said quietly. After my husband died, I wanted to find a place where I could just be ordinary, where I could love music without all the pressure and expectations. You all gave me that gift, and I wanted to give you something in return. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened. So you've been helping us all along. You knew you could play this piece from the very beginning. Margaret nodded. I wanted to help save the center. You all have been so kind to me, and I could see how much this place means to the community. I thought if I could give you the performance you needed for the fundraiser, maybe it would be worth revealing my secret. Mr. Rodriguez shook his head in amazement. And we were trying to teach you basic scales. Margaret laughed, and for the first time in months, it felt completely natural. You were teaching me something much more important than scales. You were teaching me how to find joy in music again. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations, questions, and more applause. The fundraiser was a tremendous success, raising enough money to keep the music center running for years to come. But more importantly, Margaret had found something she had not expected, a new family of people who accepted her for who she was. Both the famous pianist and the quiet woman who just wanted to belong. As she walked home that night, Margaret realized that she no longer had to choose between her two identities. She could be both the artist and the ordinary woman, the teacher and the student, the person she had been and the person she was becoming. And for the first time since Thomas died, she felt truly at peace.